The Universal Design for Learning framework developed by Harvard University is a problem-solving tool, not a set of strategies. When we look at the framework, it looks like a lot of work. There is no teacher that could do everything in the framework. It's a way of overcoming barriers to learning for students. I like to think of it like a restaurant menu. If I go to a restaurant and feel like an Italian dish, I choose an Italian dish on the menu. I don't choose everything. When I'm planning with teachers and we talk about potential barriers for students to the learning process, we don't use everything in framework. We look at the framework and we pick and choose what we're going to use to help problem solve approaches to support our students to access their barriers to learning. Put simply, the Universal Design for Learning framework consists of principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. Each of the three columns are broad principles in the Universal Design for Learning framework. They're broad ways of overcoming barriers to learning for students. Within each one of those principles are three rectangular boxes. They're referred to as guidelines. Guidelines are still broad approaches, but a bit more targeted than the general principles. Within each guideline or rectangular box, there are dot points. Each one of those dot points is referred to as a checkpoint. Those checkpoints are very targeted ways to overcome students' barriers to the learning process. Once again, they're not strategies to implement in a classroom. They give you ideas of how to support students to overcome their barriers to the learning process. Then students are supported by many different strategies. That's what I like about the Universal Design for Learning framework. Teachers can pick and choose the strategies they like as long as it meets the outcomes of those checkpoints. The Universal Design for Learning framework has been named in the Nationally Consistent Collection of Data for Students with Disability, and this is the definition that the federal government has used for teachers in Australia. When we think about the Universal Design for Learning framework and planning with teachers, we can ask ourselves three general questions during the planning process. The first question I encourage teachers to ask is, am I providing students with multiple ways of engaging in the learning process? The second question relates to the content descriptions in the Australian curriculum. Teachers are encouraged to ask themselves, am I representing the knowledge and skills in the approved curriculum to my students in multiple ways? The final question relates to the achievement standards in the Australian curriculum. Teachers need to ask themselves, am I allowing my students to provide evidence of learning against the approved curriculum in multiple ways? Now let's have a look more specifically at the Universal Design for Learning framework. So the green column is Principle 1, the idea that I engage kids in the learning process in multiple ways. The framework suggests to engage students in the learning process in multiple ways, we first need to recruit their interest. We need to support them to get interested in the learning process. Each one of the dot points within that guideline gives you specific ways of supporting students to recruit their interest in the learning process. Once teachers have recruited students' interest in the learning process, Guideline 2 in the Universal Design for Learning framework encourages teachers to think about how they support students to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. Each one of the dot points within that guideline provides more targeted ways of supporting students to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. The Universal Design for Learning framework is a hierarchy. If students are struggling with sustaining effort and persistence in the learning process, teachers need to come back to an earlier element of the framework and ask, have I recruited students' interest in the learning process? If not, they need to think about supporting that first before coming back to supporting them to sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. The final guideline in Principle 1 relates to supporting students with self-regulation. Once again, the dot points within this guideline provide more targeted ways of supporting students with self-regulation. The Universal Design for Learning framework is developed on a hierarchy approach. So before students can engage in self-regulation, we first need to support them to recruit their interest, then sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process. Then we support self-regulation. If a student is struggling with self-regulation, Rather than continue to focus on that, even though they're struggling, we need to come back and ask ourselves, can they sustain their effort and persistence in the learning process? If not, have we recruited their interest in the learning process? When representing the knowledge and skills in the content descriptors to students in multiple ways, teachers need to first think about, can all kids physically access the information being taught and the skills being modelled? In Guideline 1 of Principle 2 of the Universal Design for Learning framework, this is referred to as perception. Within this guideline, each of the dot points gives more specific and targeted ways of supporting students to access the information being taught and the skills being modelled. Once all students can physically access the information being taught and skills being modelled, Guideline 2 of Principle 2 in the Universal Design for Learning framework reminds teachers that they need to clarify all language and symbols used in information. This is because if students can't physically access the information, then understand the language and symbols being used in it, they can never comprehend the information being taught to them. The final guideline in Principle 2 talks about supporting students with comprehension. However, before students can demonstrate comprehension and be supported by teachers to do comprehension, teachers first need to ask, can all students physically access the information being taught, and have they clarified all the language and symbols being used? If a student struggles with comprehension, rather than continue to focus on comprehension, the teacher needs to ask him or herself, can all students understand the language and symbols being used in the information? If not, can all students physically access the information? In Principle 3 of the Universal Design for Learning framework, teachers are encouraged to let all students physically demonstrate the achievement standards first before they demonstrate it any other way. Once the teacher has allowed all students to physically demonstrate what they know and can do, the teacher is then encouraged to support them with their expression and communication, and communicating their knowledge and understanding and skills in multiple ways. The final guideline in Principle 3 of the Universal Design for Learning framework relates to executive functioning. It reminds teachers that they need to support students with executive functioning. And it also reminds them it's a hierarchy in terms of students demonstrating their learning. Students first need to be able to physically demonstrate what they can do before they can express it and communicate it through writing and other means. And then once they can do that, then they can demonstrate executive functioning. So if a student is struggling with executive functioning, then the teacher, rather than continue to focus on that, the first question is, can my students demonstrate their knowledge and skills through expression and communication? If not, can they physically demonstrate their learning first? With the knowledge of their students' common characteristics, associated strengths, and associated barriers to learning, teachers look at the Universal Design for Learning framework, then select checkpoints that they believe would be useful in supporting the students to overcome their barriers to the learning process and leverage their strengths to access that learning process. As the Universal Design for Learning framework is a problem-solving tool, not a set of strategies, once the teacher has identified the Universal Design for Learning checkpoints that would be useful for overcoming their students' barriers to the learning process and leveraging their strengths, they now need to identify pedagogical strategies that they could use within the classroom to support their students. Once specific strategies have been determined that meet the UDL checkpoints, teachers need to think about where they fit within the explicit instruction model and put it within one of the 4 stages. The first stage being teachers modeling the skills and teaching the knowledge by themselves, talking out their cognitive thoughts. The second stage being the teacher working with the students in the process of modeling the skills and teaching the knowledge. The third stage being students working in groups. Fourth stage being students working independently.